Albert Lin, the man who loved Taiwan so much that he became a Canadian twice. For the past 2 years, I have been sorting the papers of Dr. Albert Lin, Lin Zefu, for archival deposit in Taiwan. Based on these and his 2017 autobiography, I present today an interpretation of his life as an exemplary story of crossings between Taiwan and Canada, shaped by transformational love, the ideal of justice, and Christian hope. Ideals and crossings which characterized George Leslie Mackay's own life. Albert Lin was born into a Taiwanese family of modest means in Luodong, Ilan in 1932. The family were not Christian. His father was the oldest of 5 children and had left school early to become a tailor, at which he had become modestly successful. Albert went to Japanese public school in Luodong, but was not a good student. So he also left school early. However, in May 1946, his father's older brother returned from Shanghai, where he had done well in business, and decided that Albert needed to go to school and that the uncle would pay for it. He took Albert to Tam Sui, where Albert took the entrance test for Tam Sui Middle School, now Tamkang High School, the school founded by George William Mackay in 1914, George William Mackay being the son of George Leslie Mackay. The test was in Mandarin, of which Albert could not speak a word. Nonetheless, the principal, Dan Lingtong, admitted him. It turned out that Albert's aunt's husband was a prominent Tamkang alumnus and had asked a favor of the vice principal, Ko Shek Gai. Ko Shek Gai was the grandson of George Leslie Mackay and a teacher at Tamkang. And so in 1946, thanks to his kin and this grandson of George Leslie Mackay, Albert made his first crossing from backwater Ilan to the wider Tam Sui Presbyterian world created by George Leslie Mackay. With the school discipline and loving Christian teachers, Albert soon became a top student. Then in March 1947, the 228 massacres came to the school. Principal Dan was disappeared. A student was shot dead on the street, and the parents of 2 of Albert's own classmates were murdered. Of this, Albert writes, "Only later did I learn what a terrible blow to Tamkang the 228 was. But at that time, we didn't know what was going on. All we students knew was that the school was closed for a time." His uncle funded Albert's education up until 1949. But that year, his factory burned down and the uncle went bankrupt. Principal Dan arranged for Albert to be given free room and board and earn a small income as a tutor and a kitchen assistant. And George William Mackay added Albert to a small list of students who received $60 a year, 60 Canadian dollars a year, from a group of women at Knox Presbyterian Church in Toronto, on Spadina Avenue. In 1949, at the end of his years at junior high school, Albert was baptized, completing his crossing into Mackay's world. Skipping ahead a few years, when Albert was almost finished his university graduate study in physics, a new principal of Tamkang, Dan Sudi, was planning to pay for Albert to go to Canada for graduate study in the hope that Albert would return to Tamkang to teach. Albert turned down the offer on the idea that what if he was not able to fulfill Principal Dan's hopes. And in 1960, using funds that he himself raised, Albert over his lifetime would raise a lot of money for many different causes. He entered graduate study in physics at the University of Toronto. One of the first things he did on arrival in Toronto was to visit Anna Mackay, the granddaughter of George Leslie and daughter of George William Mackay. And she took him to meet the elderly women who had supported him at Tamkang. from physics student to blacklisted activist. Now, in 1960, there were a total of 5 Taiwanese students in the University of Toronto, and about 30 across all of Canada. That September, a Tamkang classmate of Albert's, then living in Japan, mailed Albert a copy of Taiwan Qinglian, a new publication in Japanese advocating Taiwan independence. Albert recounts. After reading it, I realized I was so ignorant of Taiwan's history and wanted to share it with other students. This magazine was an enlightenment to me, making me understand Taiwan's history and the consciousness, 自觉, I should have as a Taiwanese person. After we received Taiwan Qinglian, Huang Yiming and I decided to mail copies to every Taiwanese student in Canada. Albert and Huang Yiming used their own money, ordering the magazines from Japan and then mailing them out in Canada. To avoid any of these precious documents being lost, they put their address on the mailing envelopes so that they could be returned to sender if they didn't reach the students. Now, the KMT had spies among the students. So in 1961, Albert's return address earned him a place on the regime's blacklist, a no return address. Happily, a new Canadian policy allowed foreign graduates to apply for Canadian resident status. And so Albert, unwillingly, became a Canadian for the first time. In October 1961, Albert and Robert organized the Canadian Formosan Students Association, total membership, 5 students at University of Toronto. They put on the first Taiwan night ever in Canada performance at University of Toronto to reach out to Canadian society. Huang became the first Formosan Student Association president and Albert the vice president. It is interesting that Huang was not even Taiwanese, nor had he grown up in Taiwan. And he had even been the president of the U of T Chinese Students Association. But for the next 40 years, Huang and Albert led the Taiwanese movement in Canada, as it was with Mackay. So for Robert Huang, those who love Taiwan become Taiwanese. In 1963, they organized a trip to Niagara Falls for some 20 Taiwanese. At dinner afterwards in the China House restaurant on Eglinton Avenue, they founded the Formosan Canadian Association, now the Taiwanese Canadian Association. Because he was on the blacklist, Albert avoided being named as an executive because they wanted this to be an inclusive, non-political group for all political opinions. However, they also needed a political organization. So in the spring of 1964, they organized the Formosan League for Self-Determination, Taiwan Zhumin Zijie Lianmeng, with 20 members. Huang and Albert were president and vice president, and only their 2 names were made public. On September 20th, 1964, Peng Ming-min, a prominent professor at National Taiwan University Law School, was charged with sedition. A death sentence could await him. The charge was because he and 2 of his graduate students had printed a declaration of Taiwanese people's national salvation, Taiwan Renmin Zijiu Yundong Shenyan. The exiled Taiwanese organizations assigned the Canadians the job of mobilizing international support to save Peng from a likely death penalty. So immediately the Formosan League for Self-Determination renamed itself the Committee for Taiwan's Human Rights in Canada, Janada Taiwan Ren Xin Wei and Hui. They sent many letters and telegrams to the UN, to Canada, US, and France, and wrote press releases. In January 1965, even the influential CBC television program, This Hour Has 7 Days, did a 1-hour program on Peng's case. in pursuit of justice for Peng. In April 1965, they organized the first ever Taiwanese demonstration in Canada. 5 people on a cold April day in front of the ROC embassy in Ottawa. There were only 5 demonstrators, and 2 of them were wearing hoods to protect their identity. But there were 18 reporters, and the demonstration received wide coverage in Canadian media. Albert reflected on this years later. The immediate effect of any support movement is hard to evaluate, but the dedication of the supporters, their belief and constancy is important to any democratic country. We just muddled our way through and did our best, but had no way of knowing what effect it would have. As a Christian, I believe that we must have a prayerful heart and leave the rest to God. Throughout the 1970s, Albert was active building a wider overseas movement for Taiwan independence. At the same time, he was now a professor at Ryerson University. On January 1st, 1970, Taiwanese organizations in Canada, Japan, the US, and Europe formed the World United Promotions for Independence, WUFI, Taiwan Duli Zhenguo Lianmeng. The Committee for Taiwan Human Rights now became the Canadian chapter of WUFI. WUFI was structured as a secret cell-based revolutionary organization. Everyone used a false name. WUFI gave its members classes in revolutionary theory and methods such as urban guerrilla warfare, bomb making, and blowing up power grids. Albert, the physics teacher, was one of the teachers of these methods. On April 24th, 1970, 2 Taiwanese students at Cornell, who were WUFI members, attempted to assassinate Jiang Jingguo in New York. WUFI Canada raised $16,000 for their legal costs. After this, the Canadian cell was given the responsibility for in Taiwan mobilization work, Daogong. But what could you do from outside Taiwan? It was closed up tighter than a clam by the KMT, who had spies both in the country and out of the country. So they came up with a plan to send random mail to Taiwan. Who received it or what was in the letter didn't matter. The mail will be opened by censors anyways. They made a Chinese chop with Taiwan Duli on the chop and chopped it in the corner of the envelope, which they then covered with an attractive Canadian stamp. This was very important, attractive stamp. They hoped that people would like the stamp collecting being a popular hobby in Taiwan, at least in those days. So they would soak it off the envelope to save for their collection and then see Taiwan Duli on the chop under the envelope. Albert was also active in the Taiwanese Church in Toronto, keeping Taiwan issues before the Canadian Council of Churches International Affairs Committee and the Canada-Asia Working Group, which will be discussed by David Webster in the next presentation. But despite all of these efforts, the 1970s ended with Taiwan no closer to independence or seemingly even to democracy. In December 1978, the US announced it was switching diplomatic relations from the ROC to the PRC. The KMT canceled the December elections in which the incipient Dangwai, this is the opposition movement, which eventually became the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, was expected to take several seats. A year later, on December 10th, 1979, the Kaohsiung incident, Meidao Shujian, led to the imprisonment of almost the entire Dangwai leadership. In April 1980, even Reverend Gao Junming, General Secretary of the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan, was arrested. This coincidentally was just 1 week before I arrived in Taiwan to begin my own crossing as a missionary. Rebuilding Mackay's bridge back to Taiwan, 200 meters long. In February 1982, the Taiwanese Church in Toronto hosted a Lunar New Year party with many Canadian friends. One of the guests was an executive of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, Reverend Earl Roberts. He brought with him a Korean visitor who said that he was doing empowerment training in Asia with the World Council of Churches. Albert wasn't quite sure what empowerment training was, but once this was clarified, he was immediately struck by this urban rural mission work of training trainers to organize people for power. He wasted no time and was soon on the phone to Geneva to George Todd, head of the World Council of Churches URM program. Albert asked if he and other Taiwanese from Canada could come to the United States for training in URM organizing work. Todd told him, "You don't need to go to the US. The best training we have is right there in Toronto." His name is Ed File, a United Church minister teaching sociology at York University and leading the Canadian Urban Training Project, CUT. CUT's office was on Bond Street, literally 200 meters away from Albert's office at Ryerson. All Albert could say was, "Eureka." He wasted no time. 4 months later, the first Taiwanese Canadian urban training took place that July in Toronto. Albert, of course, raised all of the needed funds to bring students from Taiwan. He did very good at raising large amounts of money over the next decades. The first 6 trainees from Canada and Taiwan were all Presbyterian. And not surprisingly, in the years to come, URM became a very important part of the stated mission of the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan. But before 1987, Taiwan was under martial law. Albert still blacklisted, and so it was not possible to do training in Taiwan. Courses took place in Toronto, San Francisco, and Japan. The Japan project in 1986 produced 2 projects, which the students were required to do as part of their training. Plan a project which epitomized the possibilities of URM nonviolent social transformation model. One of these was the Cai Hong Tuan An, the Rainbow Project, which exposed the crime of underage Aboriginal girls being sold into prostitution and the complicity of the authorities in this process. It led to a major national outcry and changes in Taiwan. The other was a plan for an Aboriginal Return Our Land movement developed by 2 Aboriginal Presbyterian ministers. This eventually led to the famous Return Our Land Aboriginal March in Taipei in August 1988, and political demands which continue to this day for Aboriginal self-government. One of the first 1982 trainees was a student at U of T Medical School, Dr. Ray Hong Chi-Chang. He then returned to Taiwan and became a leader of the Dangwai New Tide faction, Xin Chaoliu. He was elected to the National Assembly in 1986 and then in 1989 to the legislature. The radical New Tide faction pushed the Dangwai into allying itself with the many new social movements which are developing in Taiwan. And this was a direct result of the URM training given to its members. The URM training also enabled its trainees to lead and organize huge demonstrations. 100,000 people was not unusual, without these demonstrations descending into violence when confronted by the police. Albert sums up the role of URM in Taiwan's political transformation. URM graduates committed for love and justice, and over 700 in number to the early 1990s, contributed to the nonviolent social movement for democratization and human rights through organizing people for their rightful power while challenging the authoritarian KMT regime. The road to peaceful transfer of political power in Taiwan might have taken a substantially different path with associated complications and delays without this Canadian URM approach. Rebuilding the bridge in Canada. As Taiwanese Canadians became more politically active, the Taiwanese churches in Toronto began facing internal tensions over politics. In 1982, the KMT released a longtime political prisoner, Shi Ming-xiong, yes, the older brother of Shi Ming-de, and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Leave Taiwan as soon as possible, or we'll throw you back in prison. Albert proposed that his church sponsor Shi Ming-de as a refugee to Canada. The congregation split on this question, and Albert led the activists out to found a new congregation, the Taiwanese United Church in Toronto, which then sponsored Shi Ming-xiong as a refugee to Canada. Taiwanese United Church in Toronto, over the years, was mocked by the other Toronto Taiwanese churches as the Taiwan Independence Church, Taidu Jiahui. The congregation wore this as a badge of honor, and not surprisingly, the congregation gave strong support to Albert's URM training and subsequent projects in Taiwan. In 1990, the blacklist was finally ended, and Albert was able to return to Taiwan after 32 years as a Canadian. But he kept looking for new strategies to promote nonviolent social change, as well as to strengthen URM training in Taiwan, which by this time had become especially important and effective in mobilizing Aboriginal communities. In Canada, he learned about a program at St. Paul University in Ottawa called Third Party Neutral, TPM, which trains people in methods of resolving conflict through neutral negotiators. And then he discovered something called Open Space Technology, OST, a process helping organizations which had reached a dead end to transform themselves by redefining their mission. He brought both of these programs to Taiwan, and he wrote this about that. For any normal society and country, it would be adequate enough to have URM programs to empower the people, to have TPN programs to facilitate the building of a harmonious and pluralistic civil society, and to have OST programs to constantly revitalize all civil institutions. However, Taiwan may be one important exception. Taiwan has been an independent sovereign state under constant threat and coercion from China. Unfortunately, military defensive means of countering China's threats are necessary, but they are only the minimum measures. Albert had added one more social movement to his mix: civilian-based defense. Civilian-based defense was taught at the Albert Einstein Institution in Boston, which was founded by Dr. Gene Sharp in 1983, a student of Gandhi, to advance the practical use of strategic nonviolent action in military conflict. Albert quickly became a convert and threw himself totally into this work, which he sees as a way to guarantee the security of Taiwan based on civilian mass mobilization behind the other military defense. He brought Gene Sharp to Taiwan in 1994 to promote CBD. Sharp received a polite hearing even at the National Defense College, but not a great deal of interest outside of Albert's own URM circles. Of course, Albert had raised all of the money necessary and arranged for the translation of all of Gene Sharp's books into Chinese before this happened. And so the themes of Albert's life all come together here: achieving Taiwan independence by ending KMT rule, defending Taiwan from communist Chinese conquest, and transforming Taiwan's society through nonviolent social action. In 1996, the DPP nominated Albert, and he entered the legislature as an overseas Chinese representative for North America. In the legislature, he became known as Saint Lin Sheng, for his high moral tone and his Christian courtesy, even to his KMT enemies. apart from promoting with limited success civilian-based defense, he became a leader in organizing legislators' delegations to parliaments in many countries overseas. Many of these delegations were to countries which had no relationship with Taiwan until Albert organized a visit from Taiwanese legislators to visit their legislators. This parliamentary democracy, parliamentary diplomacy became very important and is still very important today in overcoming Taiwan's formal diplomatic isolation. More bridge crossing thanks to the work of Albert Lin. At the end of his 3-year term as legislator, he was again nominated, this is 1999, as a proportional list candidate for the DPP. Now the DPP had a rule which they had passed to the legislature, and this was aimed at discomfiting KMT officials, that all public officials and legislators could not serve until they had given up any dual citizenship which they held. Many Taiwanese, of course, do hold Canadian-American dual citizenship. And so St. Lin obediently gave up his Canadian citizenship, even though he failed to obtain the threshold for election to the legislature. And so after 1999, Albert resumed a life of frequent multiple annual crossings between Canada and Taiwan. He founded the Taiwan Research Association for National Peace and Security, Taiwan 国家和平安全研究协会, to promote civilian-based defense. Sorry. But traveling on a ROC passport while having a home in Toronto did have its complications. And so in the early 2000s, he applied from zero to become a new immigrant to Canada. And after the required years of waiting, was again given Canadian citizenship. And so he became the man who loved Taiwan so much that he became a Canadian twice. Dr. Lin's story, which I tell with his permission, shows how the Christian ideals and institutional frameworks first brought to Tam Sui by Mackay in 1872 have been carried by one man back and forth across the Pacific to help transform the KMT-ruled Republic of China into 21st century democratic Taiwan, still on the road to Taiwan independence.